Good morning, Energy Rogue Nation. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Wanted to get this video out early today because day a little bit later on is getting a little bit hectic in the afternoon. So wanted to make sure I got this out as early as possible. Of course, as a reminder, the markets are not open today as a reflection of Jimmy Carter's passing. It's a day of mourning here in the United States, January 9th. I believe the market should be open tomorrow, January 10th. So feel free to check me on that, but I believe that's the case. But I wanted to go through and just give you a brief update on weather in both the United States and Europe. And this discussion is actually going to go a little bit more long-term as opposed to near-term. So we're really going to be talking more about, the next 3-4 weeks as opposed to the next week and a half, 2 weeks. But I wanted to start with wxrogue.com. I haven't shown this in a while, and again, it's still a very useful tool. As I take my headset off, didn't realize I was still wearing it. Still waking up. But this is a very useful tool nonetheless for a lot of products. And by the way, for those that haven't had the chance to use it, what I really like about this is we have your degree days broken up by EIA region. Now, we are currently working on a similar product that's out there regarding the GFS. Sorry for the handwriting, the GFS, plotting, run by run. We've seen that a lot posted on the social media universe, and it's something that we can do as well, but we are currently in the process of working through that. We are also, speaking of projects in the pipeline, also working on creating our own 5 to 10 year HDD CDD normals relative to these EIA regions. The only information that is universally public is the 15 and 30 year normals that the NCEI produces from NOAA. And those are ones that are easily pullable. If you guys need help in pulling those, or you want additional information, I'm happy to do that for you, or I can always walk you through the steps. It's all public domain. Excuse me. But what we are going to be doing is building out our own data set, our own database for those 5 to 10 year normals. Again, relative to the EIA regions that we've established and that are universally known. Gosh, it seems like the word of the day here is universal. Universally known, and also relative to how we calculate out our population and gas-weighted degree days. So that is being worked on as we speak. It's a little bit of a slow burn, but once it's done, it's going to make it a whole lot easier for all of you to be able to compare what truly is above or below normal for some of these regions. And I think that adds a lot of value. But I want to start here first because if you take a look at the latest runs from the GFS on population-weighted degree days, you see that, for the most part, we're sitting right around that 130 to 150 range. And that takes us pretty much all the way through the next 14 to 16 days. And so the reason for that is because we have, remember, an area of high pressure out in the northern Pacific, excuse me, that continues to bring down cold air south, right? If you have an ample ridge out in the northern Pacific, that helps to evac cold air further south into the United States. Now, the one thing that I've talked about is that I am expecting some milder conditions to seep in by the end of January. But I think one thing I want to just leave with, or lead off with, is that those mild temperatures are not going to affect everybody. I have more confidence that a return to mild would likely be for areas that we would expect to be mild in La Nina more often than not, which is the south central United States, the deep south, and the southeast. More on that here a little bit later on. But the point is that these heating degree days are going to be pretty much elevated over the next 14 to 16 days and is likely to continue for many EIA regions as we round out January and enter into February. The same thing can be said about your gas-weighted, gas-weighted degree days. You can tell, by the way, these both follow a very similar trend line, and that's because they should. The only difference between these two, just as a reference, is that the values of your heating degree days for population weighted are always going to be higher than that of your gas weighted, because gas weighted is an additional weight to population, right? So you're combining multiple weights. That does tend to reduce the magnitude of the value itself. Nonetheless, the point is it follows the same trend line as it should. So gas-weighted degree days, anywhere between 100 to the 120 range over the next 14 to 16 days as well. That's very elevated. And by the way, when we're referencing 100 to 120, we're really talking about those total degree days when we combine all of those regions. So what exactly is happening here in the United States? Well, let's take a look here at the CFS model. And like I mentioned at the top of the video, we're really going to be doing a longer range forecast for today's discussion, both for the United States and Europe. And so because of that, we need to rely on more climate models that can go out that far. And the CFS is an example of that. So the pattern right now at the moment, I think, is really well depicted here. And you have this positively tilted. When I mean positively tilted, meaning going in the positive y direction. So think back to algebra, the good old xy axis. Anytime I reference a positive or negative tilted trough or ridge, that's usually what I'm referring to. But either way, you can clearly see we have a strong, ample ridge that's positively tilted, and as a result of that orientation, it's allowed a lot of cold air to even get as far south as the Deep South and Texas, and that's why we have winter storm warnings out for eastern Texas, eastern Oklahoma, and much of Arkansas, and even northern Mississippi, northern Alabama. So could see some significant disruptions there, especially for Arkansas. We are expecting to see anywhere between 8 to 10 inches of snow, and as a matter of fact, I think that's going to be the worst hit area, aside from Dallas and the northern Alabama, Mississippi area. So there's going to be certainly some significant disruptions there. And Tom had a really good call out in the Discord yesterday. It was either yesterday or early this morning about the California wildfires. We are seeing some power grid disruptions. Tom's had some really good insight on that. He said, based on his perspective, that it's likely not going to cause major impacts to the rest of the energy market, so to speak. So something to keep an eye on, though, nonetheless, right? We're seeing some disruptions in California, but we're also going to be seeing some disruptions across the Deep South. And I think the interesting thing to watch, not to go completely off on a tangent, is Texas. Texas in 2021 experienced a significant hit to their power grid. Remember, their electric grid is separate from the rest of the United States, so they are specifically vulnerable, or especially vulnerable, to events like winter systems or even hurricanes, as we saw with Beryl back in that May, June of last year. We've had two significant tests of the Texas power grid really over the last 3.5, 4 years. That was Winter Storm Uri back in 2021 and the arrival of Hurricane Beryl just this past summer, both of which caused significant disruptions to the power grid. Once again, for the first time since Uri of 2021, we're expected to see another significant winter storm impacting the Dallas Metroplex today and continuing throughout the rest of this work week. So it's going to be interesting. Watch that space because the Texas power grid is once again being put to the test. And we will see how it fares against this winter system. The same can also be said for Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi. Of course, there's concerns there, but in my opinion, and considering the history of Texas' power grid, I'm a little bit more concerned about Texas than I am about Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, and much of the Gulf states, including Atlanta, Georgia, by the way. Honorable mention, as those states are likely just to see travel disruptions and some form of power outages. So more on a local level. But going back to this map, like we mentioned, this is an area of high pressure out in the Pacific. This has been responsible for a lot of that cold air across primarily the Midwest and the Northeast, and as we already talked about, now, as of this week, impacting much of the Deep South. But watch what happens. This is, by the way, I should kind of back up here a bit. This is the CFS Jetstream map, right? And this is going week by week. So if we head into the next couple of weeks, you notice that we still have that ridge hanging around the northern Pacific up towards the Gulf of Alaska. But the CFS is hinting at something that I have been expecting to come up on the horizon, which is an eventual sort of zonal transition of that ridge, which rather than having this big peak out in the Gulf of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, instead you get more of a flat jet, which would imply more milder conditions for areas of the Deep South, something they haven't seen since the beginning of the season. And so as we go forward in time, this would take us into what would be, let me see, here it is, the week of the 30th, January 2025, so the end of the month. You can see that, that ridge really begins to start to flatten out, almost to where it's primarily a zonal flow across the United States. that would mean that most of that cold air we're seeing today across much of the lower 48 would then just return and be confined to the Midwest and the Northeast, whereas areas of the South are going to see more of this zonal Pacific flow, which is going to help to pump in more of that milder temperature regime. And even some of the models in the short term, even before this, are beginning to hint next week at some temperatures returning back to the 60s for much of Texas, for example. So that personally does not surprise me. I think we are eventually going to see a correction with that upper level ridge, but the areas that I still expect to remain cold through the end of this month and into early January are the areas circled there in black, which are the primarily culprits of La Nina, and that's the Midwest and the Northeast. And if we take this a little bit further, just for fun, to the first week of February, you see that once again, we're looking here at the Aleutian Islands and the Gulf of Alaska, pretty much zonal flow. We do have a subtle ridge, but that's only bringing cold air to the northern half of the United States and not to the south. So keep an eye on that closely. I think there's certainly going to be something said about that, but I personally expect by the time we get to the end of this month, we see that Pacific high in the northern Pacific eventually return back to zonal and then pump in some more mild air across the south. And by the way, model confidence this far out is rather shaky. But the reason why I say what I say, aside from what the models are outputting, is because, as we've talked about several times over the last few months, the idea that this ridge and high pressure out in the Pacific really, and ridges in a lot of parts of the world, our atmosphere is fluid. It's not static. And so this ridge, as we've seen throughout the season, has not stayed consistent. This is actually the most consistent it's been this season. We've seen it more of like an accordion. You know, it expands, and then it contracts, and then it shifts south, and then it moves north. That is really the catalyst behind the winter that we've seen the last few weeks. If we go back to last year, that was almost non-existent, and that's why much of the United States remained mostly mild. And also that had to do with the cold air supply up north. There just wasn't enough of it. We had a really lackluster snowpack. Ice sheets were way behind climatological normals. It was pretty much a dud and dead on arrival season before it even got started. But this season, as we've mentioned and as we've been calling for leading up to now, we were expecting a much different situation, and we certainly are seeing that. So now, if we transition back, and I'll just show you one more climate model, because I'm certainly not one that likes to really, be pushing one solution. This is the CANSIPS, and it's another interpretation of the climate model. The only difference with this one, and we are still looking at our jet stream, is that we're going month by month as opposed to week by week, which nonetheless should be sufficient. But as we see, right, we go into January, and this really represents the month of January itself. We have ridging out in the northern Pacific that helps to supply cold air south, especially for the Midwest and the Northeast, as expected. But then once we get to February, right, even the CANSIPS is picking up on this idea of more of a zonal flow across the northern Pacific, which then would confine cold air back towards the northern United States and then leave the south pretty much mild. And if we use this same model, going back to really Europe, right, because this video is about Europe. I know we spent a good bulk of it on the United States given the circumstance, but we can use this same map to really look at Europe as well. And it's interesting because as we've been forecasting for folks in Western and even Eastern Europe, we changed our forecast several weeks ago to more of a mild winter for a lot of Europe. And a lot of that had to do with really upper level ridging out in the northern Atlantic, similar to that of the Pacific, which would actually supply more above normal temperatures for much of Europe as opposed to colder. And the second catalyst is this blocking pattern out towards Greenland, which is keeping cold pretty much trapped up near Greenland and points north. And then once you get that ridge out in the northern Pacific, that's swinging cold air south to the United States. That same system, as you see off towards the right here, you have cold air out towards the northern Atlantic. The problem is that's getting blocked and it's not pushing into Europe. And so you're going to see that here on a week-by-week basis. So pay close attention to this. As we go forward in time, you see ridging remains for much of Western Europe. That blocking continues out in the northern Atlantic. And then as we head towards what would be the end of January, we still see cold pretty much confined to much of the northern United States, and well, predominantly in this case up towards Greenland. And then as we get towards the beginning of February, we see ridging returning yet again for Europe. So there could be some cold air mixed in, within those weeks, especially as we get towards the end of January for Europe. But for the most part, it just looks like a mild season, at least through January, February. And I'm really not confident in March about it getting below normal or seeing any sort of return. It just seems like the northern Atlantic, with more of this, looks to be more of a positive NAO. I could be flipping those two, but considering the NAO as it is right now, the North Atlantic Oscillation, I'm pretty bearish on Europe, and a lot more bullish on cold air continuing for a good portion of the United States as we head into the end of January and into much of February. Let me just, as one last note, show you on more of a regional level what those temperature normals are looking like for Europe. And so we'll just take this over here and we'll just look at the temperature anomalies themselves. So we'll look at it from the CFS perspective. By the way, for the sake of time, I want to just tell you that the other models like the GFS and the Euro are also showing above normal temperatures continuing over the next couple of weeks. But if we do take this out beyond the next 2 weeks and into the end of January, you see these above normal temperatures continuing throughout the month of January, especially true for Eastern Europe and even back towards France and Germany. And then as we continue and we get towards that end of January, so January 30th, again, above normal temperatures for a vast majority. And of course, the Mediterranean is a slight exception, a little bit more of those cooler temperatures showing up, but for the most part, it's that's the only area that's seeing some slightly below normal temperatures. Otherwise, the rest of Europe is pretty much above normal as we even head towards February. And that's expected to continue given the NAO. So, listen, point is, above normal is expected to continue for much of Europe. We have seen some episodes of cold air in parts over the last few weeks, but it has not been consistent enough to in comparison to what the United States has been seeing over these last few weeks. It's more on an isolated basis. Listen, thank you so much for tuning in. And just as a conclusion, mild is expected to continue for Europe over the next month, and especially heading into February. While I do expect for the month of January, as we round out January, for cold air to continue to impact the Midwest and the Northeast and those northern United States, and then possibly a return to mild for the southern United States. I am expecting that to take place. And if you want a probability on that, I got about a 60% chance that scenario happens as we head towards the end of January into early February. Like I said, thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe, share with others, and we'll be back here on Tuesday with another weather video. Take care.